My name is Dave Hollenbach, the host of From Embers to Excellence, a podcast that explores the many facets of leadership from the perspectives of some amazing people. We discuss the triumphs and failures that have shaped our lives and our leadership philosophies. I've found that it isn't whether we fail that defines us, but when we do fail, how we respond. Leaders dust off the ashes and use their failures as fuel to work harder and as lessons to come back wiser and stronger, more resilient, more determined, and more committed to excellence. Today, I'm speaking with John Rennie. John is a business leader, best-selling author, speaker, and podcaster. He is the co-founder, president, and CEO of Peak Demand Incorporated, a premier manufacturer of critical components for electrical utilities. He is a former U.S. Navy nuclear submarine officer who made 7 deployments during the end of the Cold War. Prior to starting Peak Demand, he led 8 manufacturing businesses for 3 global companies. He is the author of 2 best-selling leadership books, I Have the Watch, Becoming a Leader Worth Following, and All in the Same Boat, Lead Your Organization Like a Nuclear Submariner. He is the host of the Deep Leadership Podcast. John successfully brings his unique Navy leadership experience to the business world. On a submarine crew, officers and sailors work together in cramped spaces and challenging conditions to accomplish complex missions with no room for failure. John learned quickly that the basic underlying principles for success at sea also led to high-performing teams on land. So we're going to dig into leadership. I think we're going to go pretty deep, no pun intended. There was some pun intended on that one. But John, thank you very much for coming on, and I've been looking forward to this conversation, so welcome.
Thanks, Dave. I'm looking forward to talking to you about this.
So I always like to start off where it all began. You know, where were you born and raised? What did your parents do? And really, what set you on this path to becoming a submariner?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I there's nobody in my past history that ever was on submarines. So, but I grew up in New England, actually in New Hampshire, and I grew up in a very much a blue collar family. My father was an electrician for the electric utility, which probably is the reason why I'm still in the utility kind of business today. But my father was worked as an electrician. My mother was a nurse, and just had a typical childhood in New England. But the thing is, my grandparents lived in the same town as my parents, and they were young when they had my parents, so they were fairly young. And my parents were young when they had me. So I had young grandparents, and I grew up with 2 grandfathers that both served in World War II. And as as a young boy, I was fascinated with the stories of World War II and hearing their stories. And I was just a curious kid, and I wanted to know everything they did. One was in the Navy, and one was in the Army, and I just got to hear all their stories and just what they did. I knew kind of early on that I was going to do that I was going to go in the military, because that's something that I just always said, that's something that was really unique in their history that I wanted to do as well. I wanted to serve my country. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but I started researching, like when I was just young, maybe getting into junior high school. I started reading these stories about submarine crews in World War II and the missions they went on. My grandfather was not a submariner; he was on surface ships, but I kept reading these stories of, like, both in the Atlantic and Pacific, but mostly in the Pacific theater, these daring raids that these submarine commanders went on, and how many submarines we lost, and but yet how much damage they did to the enemy. And I just kept thinking about what a fascinating thing to do is to be part of a submarine crew and want to go on these daring missions. And back then, the Cold War was on, and we had this big battle, we had this Cold War between these 2 superpowers, and submarines were a big part of it. And I just said, I want that in the worst way. I want to become a submarine officer. So I just I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't have anybody in my history that's ever been, an officer or submarine officer. So I had to figure out, okay, what do I need to do? And one of the things you need to do is you had to be technically strong, because you had to become, you had to go to nuke school. You had to become a nuclear engineer. And nobody in my family was ever an engineer. I didn't even know what an engineer was. I had to figure out what it was. But eventually I figured out, okay, well, I got to be good in math and science. I got to get into a good engineering school. And then that gives me a shot at getting to the fleet. So that's what I did. I had pretty decent scores in high school. I wasn't valedictorian, but I was good enough to get into a good engineering school. And then I got accepted into the nuclear power program, which is a whole thing that you have to go and interview with an admiral and all this stuff. And then I got accepted in the submarine force. So when I graduated, I got a chance to go to nuke school in Orlando, where you're at in your area. Went to nuke school in Orlando, went to prototype in Connecticut, submarine school. Then I went to the fleet. I was on the USS Tennessee, and I spent 5 years as a naval officer on the USS Tennessee. So I got to carry out a young kid's dream, which few people do. Well, you're a firefighter, so you know that a lot of kids say, I want to be a firefighter, I want to be a police officer, I want to be an astronaut, I want to be a fighter pilot. Very few of those kids ever do those things. I'm one of those kids that said I wanted to be a naval officer on a submarine, and I got to do it, which is really cool to do, like your life, like a childhood dream. And I never forgot that. Those 5 years to me was just, something that I cherish, and I'm so glad I did.
Walk me through the transition of leaving the Navy and becoming an entrepreneur and a leader in business.
Yeah, it's a very hard thing when you step off that submarine. I was maybe 25, 26 years old, and I was in charge of $1 billion of assets. My last job on the submarine, I was the strategic missile officer, which meant I was in charge of 24 nuclear missiles, right? In my mid 20s, right? And so I left and I went to go work at a large global company as an associate design engineer, which, by the way, is a nice title for you're the lowest man in the engineering department, right? And they gave me a cubicle and a stapler, and it took them a month to get me a computer. But I went from being in charge of like billions of dollars and dangerous things with men that are highly capable to a cubicle. And it was really hard for me. And I think a lot of people getting out of the military find that too. There's a brotherhood, right? And at the time, there were no women on submarines. So when I say a brotherhood, it really was a brotherhood. There were no women on board. There was this brotherhood that there was a bond that we had with my shipmates, that when I left the military, it was really hard that bond was missing. It wasn't a 24/7 thing anymore. You worked during the day, you went home at night, you had your weekends off. And I just found it to be incredibly boring. I was like, this is it? This is what life is? I mean, how boring is this? And but then I realized what I learned in the military I could apply to business life, which was when you got to a submarine, you're what's called unqualified. And they had an interesting name they called you a nub. And a nub meant you were a non-useful body. And so you were useless until you got qualified as a submariner. So when you got fully qualified, it takes about a full year once you get to the boat before you're fully qualified and you get to what's called your dolphins. And that's your warfare pin. And that submarine dolphins means you're submarine qualified. You're an officer that can operate a nuclear submarine. When you have those dolphins on your chest, you're somebody, right? Everybody respects you. Everybody knows you have their back, right? Because you're fully qualified in all watch stations. Well, I took that idea into the civilian world with me. I'm like, all right, how do I become qualified in this company? How do I learn these things? Because no one's teaching me. They sort of stuck me in a cubicle and left me alone. And so I ended up developing my own way of learning what this company did. And just like in the Navy, I started in the engine room as a nuclear engineer, and I worked my way up to the front of the boat where I, operated as officer of the deck. I did the same thing in my civilian career. I started in engineering, and then I worked my way up to the front of the business, because that's where it was, that's where the fun is at. And that's just me. I have an engineering background. I have a degree, but I don't like it to practice engineering. I want to drive the ship. I want to be in the front of the boat. I want to be where marketing, sales, product development, running the financials. I wanted to be there. So what I did was I just learned everything I could about the company until I got into opportunities where I could move to the front of the boat. And in 5 years from when I left the military, my first company gave me my first manufacturing plant. So I got my first ship, if you will. If you consider a manufacturing plant like a ship, we had 140 people. At 32 years old, I got my first manufacturing plant, and that's when I knew this is what I wanted to do. It was sort of my next mission in life was running manufacturing plants. Yeah.
What led you to write a book?
Well, I'm an old man now, so I'm 54 now, so I'm getting toward the end of my career, and and I guess I think I'm reflecting a lot on the lessons I learned under the ocean and how I applied those lessons in the companies I've run. And I just wanted to pass on those experience and that knowledge, because what I found is the things that I do, the things that I did in business, and I'm still doing in business, were rather unique. And now as I'm older, I realize that I can trace their roots back to those fundamentals I learned in the Navy, being around a crew 24/7 in a very dangerous situation where, you may not know this, listeners may not know this, but the submarines don't operate with other ships. Most ships in the Navy operate in these convoys. So there's always a support vessel around. You have backup if you need it. Submarines operate entirely alone in the middle of nowhere. We're hundreds of miles away from the nearest support ship or base, and we're hundreds of feet in the ocean. And so we have an enemy, which is seawater, that is just surrounding us and wanting to get in and kill us and crush us like a tin can. And of course, we have the Soviets out there looking for us as well. So we had to depend on each other to be able to carry out the mission and get ourselves home safely. And that mindset of working together to accomplish the mission, I brought that into in my business life as well. It was always that thing. Every business I ran, I was trying to build us a team to accomplish the mission and meet our objectives and take care of. We operated as a group. And I think that fundamental mindset came from those days under the ocean. So just sort of translated throughout my entire business career. But 6 years ago, I spent 22 years working for 3 global companies. And then 6 years ago, I hung up my corporate hat and I started my own company, my own manufacturing company, because I really wanted to see if I could do it, that I could build something from scratch, from the ground up, with all the knowledge I had, all the lessons I learned. Can I start a business? And I've done that. So we're 6 years into the business. We're still growing great. So so I've been able to sort of prove that one last thing in my life. Can I start a business from scratch? And I was able to do it.
I think this is in one of your books, but where you talk about why tough times are so important in a leader's career development.
Yeah.
Well, first, which book is that in?
It's in I've written 3 books now, and my 3rd book just came out and it just barely hit the bestsellers list, so I'm excited about that. And that's called You Have the Watch. But so the book the book that's my passion, that was really the book I really wanted to write. And you're an author, so you have a book in you. And the one I wanted to write is called All in the Same Boat. It's this, if you're watching on video, it's behind me, but All in the Same Boat. That's really stories from my Navy days and my business life, and it's separated by 8 major lessons. And I talk about that in that book. So the idea that the tough times, and I say celebrate the tough times really make us who we are as leaders. We need those tough times. And really, I start this story in a parallel story between my grandfather and me. And it's really wild. At 24 years old, I was in the North Atlantic, in a major storm. We were going up to a patrol area in the North Atlantic, heavy winter storm, to where we were getting thrashed about left and right. Heavy seas. And, it's interesting. My grandfather was 24 years old in the same area of the Atlantic Ocean in a major battle 40 years earlier. He was 24 years old. We were the same exact age. It was the same area of the Atlantic Ocean. And he was in a battle between, so in his case, U.S. intelligence believed that there were German submarines coming to the East Coast with missiles on them to attack Boston and New York City. And so there was this operation called Operation Teardrop, and my grandfather's ship was part of that to try to stop these 25 U-boats coming across the ocean. And my grandfather's ship, the USS Frost, got into a battle with a sister ship, USS Stanton, against 2 German U-boat submarines in the middle of a massive winter storm. And at the end of they battled all night long. And at the end of the night, they sank both those German submarines. And if you know anything about submarine and ship battles, the submarines almost always win. It's very rare that the ships win. So, but that experience my grandfather went through, it changed him as a person. He was the most relaxed, calm, easygoing person you've ever met in your whole life. And that's because nothing in his life was ever as hard as what he went through in that winter storm. And the same thing with me, that the tough times I faced in the military, that winter in the North Atlantic was the toughest thing I'd ever went through. And nothing in my Navy career was ever even remotely close like that. It was never that difficult. So when you have those tough times, it sets a new standard for you. You say to yourself, if I got through that, I can get through anything. You know, it's that high water mark in your life where you say, this is something that I've done something really difficult and I've overcome it. And nothing else looks that hard anymore. Even my civilian life, there's nothing that's ever been as hard as my life in the Navy. So where some of my colleagues would be panicking when the numbers didn't look good or some customer was upset, I would just smile at it because I'm like, okay, it's not as bad as being in the North Atlantic in the middle of a massive winter storm, right? So, and the movie The Perfect Storm or the book The Perfect Storm. So this is virtually the same area 6 months before that storm occurred. So that's roughly to tell you how nasty it was. So, but my point is that these tough times, right? They really create this new benchmark for your life, and that it gives you something where you look back and say, if I have achieved that, I can achieve anything. The other thing is, and you know this, as a firefighter, when you go through those tough times with a group of people, you have this bond that's something special. When you've stood shoulder to shoulder with your colleagues for a really tough time, these are friends for life. These are people that when they have your back and you have their back, you build this bond. And so even in business, when I've gone through some really rough patches in business, those connections became tighter with the people that I was shoulder to shoulder with in those tough times. So nobody wants to go through tough times, but when we go through them, we really come out stronger. And so, I always say, if you're right in the middle of hell, it's okay, it's all right, learn those lessons and what do they say in the military? Embrace the suck, right? Because you're going to gain something out of that experience. So don't be wishing for the good times, just be wishing to be strong enough that you can get through the current time. So, hey, there it is. Embrace the suck. So you're a rucker too, I see. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so I think those are really important in our lives. And I'm thankful for the tough times I've had in my life because it's made me who I am today.
One of the things that I really love about history, reading about some of history's greatest leaders and looking at who they were before they were somebody.
Yeah.
And the mistakes that they made, some of them really, really big mistakes that you would think would be career ending and they would just kind of disappear, but that's not who they were.
Yeah.
And having that grit and I think mindset of saying, okay, this experience isn't going to define me. I'm going to use this experience as a lesson or, the foundation of something great. And this is how I'm going to do it. And I'm going to move forward. I'm going to just keep on getting back up and dusting myself off. And I'm going to keep pushing forward. And that ability to overcome adversity, like you were saying, it gives you this sense of you now know that you're capable of so much more than you thought you were.
Yeah. Well, I think you need to be tested, right? everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? I think it's that. And then, and when you've been punched in the face, you're like, all right, that's what that feels like. So now I know what to do next, right? I mean, I think those it's okay to have those rough times, because I think we become stronger, over those things. And I know for me personally, it's given me a lot of confidence. I would say this is like I told you, my grandfather was like the calmest guy I ever knew. And now that I know a lot of his story in World War II, it makes a lot of sense as to why he was the way he was. Nothing rattled his cage, because you couldn't rattle his cage any more than was rattled that night in the Atlantic, going up against 2 German U-boats. There's just nothing that could have been like that. So, and I think we can be that way as leaders, as we test ourselves and we overcome these challenges. We can be that, in a bad storm, right? What do you want at the helm? You want the captain that's got that's grizzled, right? He's got a little salt in his teeth. He's been through storms. He knows how to handle it. And I think when it comes to business, when the tough times come, that's when everyone looks at you as the leader and they're like, what are you going to do about this? How are you going to get us through this? They want that grizzled captain that has those experiences that say, it's all right, we're going to get through this. This is how we're going to do it. And they want to have someone that's been through the tough times. So, and these guys can trust the leader to lead them out of the tough situation. So yeah, tough times are, nobody seeks them out, but they are really important for our careers and in our personal development.
Since my background is in firefighting, and you talk about how firefighting on a submarine is a powerful analogy for business leaders. And for those listening that aren't familiar with the Navy, every sailor is trained on shipboard firefighting, but it's something completely different in a submarine. So
yeah,
I want to hear this just as much as the people listening. So
yeah, it's a really interesting thing on a submarine, and for those listening, you know that if there's a fire in a building like your office or school, what are you taught to do? Well, evacuate the building and call 911, right? So you get out of harm's way and let the professionals fix the problem, right? Put out the fire. The guys that are the professional firefighters, right? On a submarine, there was no that luxury. Like I mentioned, we were operated alone out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, no support craft in sight. When there's a fire, we don't run away, we run towards the fire. So in fact, my first job on board, as an officer, as a junior officer, my job was to get to wherever the fire was as quickly as I could, take charge of the firefighting, get in contact with Damage Control Center, and operate the firefighting team until I was relieved by the executive officer. So the executive officer would be the next guy to come in charge. But my job was to get there first, organize, and fight the fire. So think about it. We're trained to go against our natural instincts. Our natural instincts are to run away from a fire. But in the Navy, we're taught to run towards the fire. So the analogy that works really good with business is, I noticed when I got into the civilian world, when I was working for these big companies, every time there's a problem, people would move away from the problem. I noticed that everybody was like, ooh, I don't want to get involved with that customer complaint, that product defect, that cost problem. People were like, because everybody was all about career preservation. So I don't want to get, wrapped around that particular problem. I got to watch out for my career, my paycheck, my family. I got a kid going to college, all these reasons. So what I notice is when there's problems, a lot of times in organizations, people move away from the problems. And then what happens? Those problems tend to be like small fires. They get bigger over time and eventually get to the point where they can really damage the reputation of the company, the profitability of the company, the customer relationships. And time after time in my 22 years in corporate, I saw problems that were allowed to grow and fester and were unchallenged, create very bad situations. In fact, most of the tough things I dealt with in business were because there were small problems that weren't taken care of when they were small. So in the book, All in the Same Boat, I have a whole chapter called Run to the Fire. And it's the idea that in business, we have to run towards where the problem is, and we've got to put it out while it's still small before it grows into something that can hurt our business, hurt our employees. We got to move to those fires quickly. And we got to create a culture that where we move towards problems, not away from problems. And that, the businesses I've run, we've always tried to have that mentality that we want to move towards problems. We want to celebrate those that are good at finding them and taking action to make sure things don't grow. So I think that's part of the analogy is take care of problems before they get out of control. And like I said, you have to go against your natural instincts of career preservation. Oh, I don't want to touch it. I don't want to get involved with that, right? But you got to move towards it. And I took over one business towards the latter part of my career, and so I was the new vice president, general manager of this division. I came in and I noticed all this high warranty cost, all these high customer concession costs, and I'm like, what is going on? And we had a product that was failing in the field, and had been failing in the field for like 5 years. And so we kept shipping out new product and sending customer, extended warranties and things like that. It turns out there was a serious defect with the product that hadn't been addressed, and everybody knew about it, but everybody was too afraid to tackle the issue. And when I discovered it and dug deep about it and tried to figure out the best way to solve it, realized that there was no quick and easy fix. So I ended up canceling and stopping that entire product. We shut down the product line. We stopped selling it. And I went and visited personally with every one of the customers and set up a plan for us to be able to take care of their existing product in the field. But it was a major disaster because we didn't attack the problem when it was small. So it cost this company I worked for millions and millions of dollars because we ignored a problem that allowed it to burn out of control. And unfortunately, I was the guy that had to do the cleanup work. So I called it the Great Apology Tour. I had to travel around the country apologizing to all these major electric utilities. And it was not a fun job, but that left an imprint in me that I would never never allow that to happen on my watch.
Well, that's a really cool story.
Well, as a firefighter, that, right? I mean, you've got to attack the problem. Well, there's a lot more strategy to firefighting than I know compared to what you know. But it's about attacking the problem when it's small before you allow it to get out of control. And I think it was a big thing in the Navy. You got to get that fire out quickly because it'll damage weapons. It'll fill the hull full of smoke. It's gonna kill sailors. You got to get that thing out quickly.
There's a thing that I like to do with guests where I've kind of like looked at people's lives and the lessons that they learn in these 3 phases of life. And I ask what the most important lesson they learned in each of those phases. And the first phase would be like from birth until graduating high school. And then from that point till, you're in your professional career and you're learning those lessons and cutting your teeth. And there's some really valuable lessons that you learn during that time, you're making mistakes and all that. And then the third phase is where you're at now, where you're able to look back and take these lessons, put them together and help other people either pick themselves up or learn those lessons before they actually have to make a mistake.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. I think I'm in that third phase where I feel like it's important to pass it on. I mean, I have my mission is to build a world with better bosses. That's what I do in my podcast. I do my books. I trying to teach the next generation. I teach at a lot of colleges where I go and teach graduate programs, where I come in and do a leadership lecture in a graduate program. But it's all about, building a world with better bosses. I saw too many really bad leaders throughout my entire career. And I just want to share those lessons I learned over the years, the scars, the wounds, the bruises. I want to get those out there so that people can learn, what are some things I should be doing in different situations. So yeah, I think I'm in that phase of my life where it's about, and it's a new mission, really. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur, a successful entrepreneur. That business, it's a big part of my life, but but this whole podcasting and writing is all about, is sharing that knowledge and that wisdom as I get a little older. I get a little bit of gray in my beard. So,
Well, what what would be, if you were talking to your children and you're passing on this wisdom to them, the biggest lesson that you learned in your early life, and then the biggest lesson you learned, as a young adult, and then maybe what lesson would you want to pass on to somebody that's in the same phase of life as you, and a lesson that you've learned in trying to pass on this information to other people?
yeah, I think early on in my life is, I suffered from imposter syndrome quite a bit. I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire, and I went on to become, I went on to do some pretty amazing things. But every time I was in a new challenge, I felt like I didn't belong. I felt like, someone made a mistake. I really shouldn't be here, especially when I got to nuke power school. That was probably where I was looking around at like graduates of Stanford, MIT, and all these great engineering schools. And I'm like, oh, shoot, I'm going to get crushed here. And I think the lesson I would say is that, if you're in a position, if you've been accepted and you've been moved to a certain role, don't act like you shouldn't be there. You belong there. Someone felt you had the skills, the talent to be there. So, watch out for that imposter syndrome, because I think it can, there's two things. One, it could bring you down and doubt who you are. But the other thing is, I think what I learned to do is I used it a little bit as a chip on my shoulder. So I was out to prove that some kid from New Hampshire that didn't belong here could still do it. So it for me, it was fire. It motivated me to go, to prove to everybody I deserved to be there. But I think it could just as easily been something that shut me down as well. So, but that's a real thing. Imposter syndrome is a real thing. I definitely experienced it in my early days. So just watch out for that. As I got older, I would say as I got into business and I started running operations, as a young factory manager, I thought I needed to know all the answers. So I thought that the general manager, the guy in the corner office, had to have all the answers, had to be the smartest person in the room. And I think the big thing I learned in my first plant was that I didn't have to have all the answers, that the people around me actually had a lot of everything I needed to know to make the right decisions, but I had to tap into that resource. So I think humbling myself a bit and being able to listen to others and seek the more experienced employees, the people that have seen things before. And so I think I made that shift from being like, oh, I have to have all the answers, to I have to have all the right questions and be willing to listen. So that was a big transition of mine. And I think probably the latest thing in life is that that I've been learning and I really appreciate is that I appreciate freedom more than I do money. So, I think when you're younger, you're sort of chasing money and you're chasing a career and you're trying to do best. I had I had two boys, make sure to save for college, you pay the mortgage, do my role as a father, as a husband. And you're kind of making money and you're continuing to get promoted. But once I left corporate, I felt like free for the first time in my life. I really felt like, oh, if I want to sleep in, I can, even though I never do. But I mean, I can do what I want to do, and I can lead the way I want to. I can treat my people the way I want to. I can take vacations when I want to. And I really felt a freedom that I never had before. So I think I was always been working for somebody. I was in the military. I was working for big companies. I was very dutiful, and I was the guy that would get things done, and people depended on me. And I think for the first time I've seen freedom. And so, yeah, that's something that I've learned in the last few years that I can really appreciate, that I appreciate my freedom more than anything else. So the freedom to write books and have podcasts and do these sort of things, and meet amazing people like you is what I enjoy doing now. So I'm not chasing the next promotion or the next pay. I've got to where that's not as important to me as my time with my my wife. Well, we're empty nesters now, with my wife and my 2 golden retrievers and the vacations we take, and that's important to me now. So,
John, thank you so much for having this conversation with me and sharing so much of your life with the audience. And um, for those listening, what's the best way for people to connect with you, to listen to your podcast, purchase your books? Yeah.
Yeah, everything's on my website. It's johnsrennie.com, and everything is there. The podcast is Deep Leadership, but there's links on the website for that. But yeah, johnsrennie.com. There's ways to reach me on there. I'm pretty heavy in social media. Twitter is where I spend a lot of my time. So and it's John S. Rennie on Twitter too. So reach out to me there. I meet a lot of cool people on Twitter. I've actually physically have met a lot of the people I think are cool on Twitter. I physically have gone out and now have relationships in the real world with those people. So Twitter can be a pain in the butt, but it also can be an amazing tool. So reach out to me on Twitter or my website.
All right. Well, I will have a link to your website, and you have a Twitter link on your website, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. All the links are there. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I will have a link to your website in the show notes. So everybody listening, you can, once you're done listening to this episode, go to the show notes, click on the link, and you'll be able to learn a whole lot more about John there. So thanks again, John.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of From Embers to Excellence. Please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Follow me on your favorite podcast platform, and visit hollenbachleadership.com for additional content. My goal is and always will be to add value to as many people as possible. So if I can be of any assistance to you or someone you know, please connect with me via email or on one of my social media accounts, linked on the homepage of my website. Remember, our failures don't define us unless we let them, and the only true measure of a leader is the success of their team.